Hello, everybody. I'm Lauren Feldman, your host. Welcome to a 21 Hats conversation with Charlie Gaudet, who founded and runs Predictable Profits, a consulting business that coaches entrepreneurs. How you doing, Charlie?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Let's start. Why don't you tell us a little bit about predictable profits? What do you guys do?
Gotcha. Well, the company was founded in 2010. We coach and work with some of the smartest entrepreneurs on the planet. They range in size anywhere from startup to we have clients that are doing over $100 million. Typically, they're coming to us
That's a
for
broad range.
that is, and part of the reason why is because we're also partners with many large organizations that will send their business owners to us for coaching and development. And so while we specialize in working with 7 and 8 figure companies, the reality is that we need to make sure that our team is adapt to be able to handle uh, companies and scale companies at different levels.
That
Believe it or not, though, I'll tell you that startups are harder to coach than 8 and 9 figure companies.
Why is that? That's interesting.
So a business doesn't fail because of a lack of a good idea. A business fails because of a lack of momentum. And so when you look at a company that's doing even 6, 7, or 8 figures, they're generating lots of momentum. So they're generating traffic, they're generating leads, they're generating sales. And so our philosophy and our methodology for growing companies is about looking at, what is currently working in these businesses and how do we do more of it? And it sounds super simple. Um, but that's when you look at the companies that we've taken to the Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies list, it wasn't because of some sort of awesome marketing funnel whiz bang secret that's never been revealed before. It came down to the fundamentals of let's look at what's working and how do we make it better. And on the contrary, let's look at what's not working and how do we either improve it or just cut the fat altogether.
One of the reasons I think I was a little surprised when you said that it can be easier working with the larger companies than with the startups is because I immediately imagined that the startup entrepreneur might be more coachable than a more seasoned entrepreneur. Is that the case or no?
It's actually quite the contrary.
Interesting.
Yeah, with seasoned entrepreneurs that are doing 7 or 8 figures, at this point they start to know what they don't know, and they know the questions that need to be answered. Uh, Startups tend to be overly optimistic. It's not uncommon for me to meet with a startup and say, okay, what are your goals over the next 12 months? And where they're generating no revenue for them to say something like $10 million. They tend to be overly optimistic versus another entrepreneur that maybe the center of the bell curve. Most companies come to work with us, they're doing about $1 to $3 million a year. And they're saying, why is my business not growing any faster? Or how do we generate more predictability in our revenue? Or just my business is too dependent on me. But they're looking at that point for more scalable marketing and sales strategies. So, they understand, okay, we got our company to this point. Now, what do we need to do to get it to that next level? It's less about, oh, we're here, we got a great idea, let's do $10 million. Now it's like, okay, I've tried a lot. I need to get to the next milestone, and I realize I'm missing something. And it appears I'm missing a scalable marketing and sales strategy. So can we talk about that? So it's a higher level of discussion versus let's just go make a whole ton of money. And so it's funny too, right? So companies are at what we call like a hierarchy of needs, just like humans. With humans, at the very basic level, we need to have food and shelter. And so with a startup, they need to bring in money. And so oftentimes it's whatever it's going to take for a quick buck. And at that point, they are looking at growth hacks and something, super simple. versus another company that's doing over $1 million a year. They're higher up in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So they're not necessarily looking for, how do I put more, I need to put food on my table. At that point, it's like, how do I make smarter decisions?
Interesting. That kind of plays into something I've thought about a lot, which is one of the things I admire about entrepreneurs is they're by definition willing to keep going even when everyone tells them
Yeah.
they've got their idea is not going to work. They should go get a job. Uh, it's too hard. There are a million reasons not to start a business, and they choose to ignore all those reasons. And sometimes that builds even after they've opened their door for business. So they learn to believe in themselves, to trust themselves if they have any success at all, and they keep going. But at a certain point, they then have to learn to take advice because nobody knows everything they need to know to build a business.
Yep.
How do you convince somebody who has learned to trust themselves, learned to keep going by ignoring what others are telling them and sticking to what they believe in their heart? How do you convince that person to try something different?
I don't. I, and that's the thing. So I don't try to convince anybody to do something different.
Interesting.
Um, you know, it's like going to the doctor, for example. Many people have been told that you got to lose weight, you got to lose weight, you got to lose weight, right? And no matter how many times somebody tries to convince them to put down the pizza and, put down the alcohol and just lose weight, a lot of people just don't do it. But there gets to a point, people make decisions for two reasons: inspiration or desperation. You see a lot of people that finally decide, you know what, I'm going to lose weight because I'm getting married and I want to look great in the photos. And so that inspiration is enough for them to say, okay, what do I need to do to lose weight? Or on the contrary, they may find out that they've got a terminal illness. And at that point, they'll listen to whatever the doctor tells them. That's enough motivation and leverage. And so I don't convince anybody that they need to listen to me. It's usually at that point when there is a pain or they are a certain amount of drive and inspiration. And they're like, look, I recognize that I can take my company to a certain level. Now I'm open to ideas to taking it to the next level. And I don't sell people. I sell them through serving. So there's no sort of hype. It's selling through serving. If I can demonstrate a quantifiable impact before they're even paying me, they draw that conclusion themselves. They're like, oh my gosh, we just spent, 45 minutes on the phone and you just shared something to me that I didn't know. And that's the key with any business and any sort of sales organization. When you look at a sales structure, there is where your prospect is now. There is where they want to go. The sale happens naturally when you can bridge that gap between where they are and where they want to go. And when you bridge that gap and they make this sort of connection in their mind that goes, wow, that changes everything, the deal is sold. You don't have to resort to hype or scarcity or all these other tactics. That's what they're looking for.
It has to be something that is convincing to them, though, and you're describing a strategy, perhaps with some promise to produce results. What makes it real for them? What makes them believe that that's going to work?
So in my business, so much of what we do, it sounds crazy, right? But it comes down to common sense. We know that people do business with other people they know, they like, and what else? Trust, right? They know, like, and trust. And so if you're trying to put something into play or you're trying to create this business and you're running into problems, chances are you're running into problems on the very front end because people don't know, like, or trust you. So that falls into three simple buckets. So which one is it and how do we solve it? And for a lot of people, it comes down to, they don't know us, especially if you look at outbound. When people say, my outbound processes aren't working. Okay, do they know, like, and trust you? No. How do we get them to know, like, and trust you before you actually reach them for the first time? Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. And it's like, well, what if we did that? What if we did such and such? What impact do you think would make in your business? Oh, that would increase the response rate. Interesting. By how much? I mean, if it had just increased it by, such and such a percent, that'd make a huge difference. They just made that conclusion themselves. I
Got
don't
it.
have to convince them. If I have to convince you, I'm doing something wrong. If I can show you something where you're like, that changes everything, that's exciting.
Who are you seeing these days? We've been through a year unlike any other, the past 12 months. Um, are the companies that are coming to you more desperate than had been the case previously?
Um, no, I don't. You might find this shocking, and maybe it's just the type of businesses that we bring on. I mean, you know, the most commonly we heard people say, "My pipeline is drying up." What do we need to do to fill our pipeline? Or, we have a travel company that says, oh my God, what do we do? I mean, all of a sudden our sales have stopped. Um, but these are entrepreneurs, again, because the level of entrepreneurs that I work with, and maybe this is a play on semantics, but they're not desperate because they understand that, okay, the environment has changed. I need to adapt and I'm so close to it. I just need help seeing what I don't see. And so it's just a matter of saying, okay, let's take a look at where you're at right now, because what was working prior to 2020 has all of a sudden stopped working. And so now it's like, okay, it stopped working. Why? So they're looking to understand, why did it stop working? And what do I need to do differently in order to achieve a better result? Does
Can you
that make
tell us?
sense?
It does make sense, but it might help. Could you kind of walk us through your process a little bit? Let's say a travel company comes to you and says the pipeline is drying up. We need to do something. This is a new client. They
Yep.
walk in your door. What do you do?
So this is a great example, and this demonstrates the robustness of the methodology that all of your listeners can use inside of their own business. Because it's real simple for somebody to tell you how to grow their business when the market's going up and the economy is doing well. But it's another thing, and where the rubber meets the road is if you can use a similar methodology and continue to grow it when all hell is broke loose, right? And that's what happened in 2020.
So I heard.
So, and that's what happened. So, I had a conversation with the CEO of a global travel organization, very, very, very smart, brilliant man. And he says to me, he goes, Charlie, help me figure this out. Uh, you know, the coronavirus, by all intents and purposes, has made it impossible for us to do business. I mean, we only get paid when we put people on a plane. I mean, we're selling international travel. What do we do? I mean, how do we resolve this? So our philosophy is broken down into three main things, or our methodology when we grow companies. OSI, it's an OSI method, right? Optimization, systemization, and then innovation. So the optimization part is about, let's find out where all the areas of momentum exist in your business to answer the question, how can we do more of it? And how can we do less of what's not working? Do more of what's working, less of what's not working. So even in this case, with the travel industry, the world is shut down. We're looking for the areas of momentum. So I said, well, let's start with a basic baseline question. Do you still have traffic coming to your website? Yeah, we have tons. Okay. Do you still have people signing up for your email newsletters and people opening your emails, whatnot? Yeah, tons. You have people clicking on the messages. Yeah. We have tons. That's the momentum we're looking for. So look, here's what we know. There's been
Can I
five,
stop you there for 1 second?
yeah.
Do you think that situation was typical of most travel agencies, or was there something special about this one that the interest was still being expressed even though people couldn't travel?
Well, we knew that people wanted to travel. It's just in their minds, they felt that they couldn't travel or it didn't make sense to buy now because they
Sure.
can't get on a plane anyway. So why buy now?
I get, but I'm wondering, was this business exceptional in that people were still coming to it and expressing that interest, Or do you think that pent up interest was there for most decent travel agents?
Well, I'll go on the line and say that any industry, because I'm giving you an example of travel industry, but in almost every industry across the board, everything from, you know, sheep horns, right? Sheep horns, and this is
Okay.
a very nice to have item, all the way through to, we talk travel, B2B agencies or whatnot. Every single one of these industries, we've leveraged the momentum to figure out how do we need to adapt and change the message in order to change with the changing buyer's journey, right? So when we change that, we get different results. See, in my lifetime, we've had 5 inflection points: 1987, 2000, 2001, 2008, and then now. An inflection point is anytime uh, things change so drastically that everything that worked before the inflection point needs to be reevaluated. And so we had an inflection point in 2020. That means buying habits changed. Just like in 2008, when there was a massive financial crisis, buying habits changed. People started looking at things differently. 2001, 9/11, right? So people looked at things differently. And so in 2020, we're faced with 4 decisions. Do more. We have to change the message to meet the existing market, change the market to meet the message, change both the market and the message, or sit tight, do nothing, and pray that things change. So when we looked at the momentum in the existing travel agency, we said, okay, people are clicking, they're seeing the message, but they're not buying. So how do we have to change the message to meet the market? So we know that they're still interested in travel, that they can't. So we changed the message to say, hey, look, even though you can't travel, if you enroll now, we'll give you something to look forward to, and we can still pass the savings on to you, and so forth. And so the result of that CEO making a very strategic move and changing the message as quickly as he did, he ended up having record KPIs month after month after month. In December of 2000, his e-commerce sales were 400% greater than they were the year prior. So in
That's unbelievable.
2020, when the world was shut down, 400% higher e-com sales compared to 2019 when the world was still thriving. So he now has to the best of our knowledge, the number one best producing travel agency in the entire world within his specific niche, right? So if it can work for travel in the middle of coronavirus, it can work for every business across the line. And again, for those listening, it's how do you change your message to meet your existing market? Do you keep the message and change your market? Do you change both the message and the market? Or do you sit tight and do nothing? And anybody that sat tight and did nothing inevitably ended up struggling. But there are examples across the board in the restaurant industry. When restaurants were shut down, and some of them are now opened or whatnot, the restaurants that thrived are the ones that adapted and said, how do we change and do things differently? And there were restaurants that said, you know what we'll do is we will ship bags of raw goods to your house, including, mixed drink, combinations to your house. We'll hold an event. We'll do a Zoom live with our chef, and we'll walk you through and we'll make the meal together. We'll make this a big community thing, and everybody else who's on the Zoom will also be there. And the restaurants that did that, some of them thrived. We have a client that had more food sales, not alcohol, but more food sales than he did pre-pandemic, just by running a whole bunch of different options. And then you had other restaurants that maybe didn't do as well, but they did enough to be able to stay in business, which in these times are, that's still a pretty good accomplishment, right? But
Sure.
it's adapting. I think it was Dr. Edwards Deming that has a quote that said, you don't have to adapt. Survival is not necessary. But
Let me ask you this. Yeah, I host a podcast, and one of the regulars on our podcast, it's a weekly conversation among business owners who I've been talking to throughout the crisis. And one
Mhm.
is an owner who has a business that makes high-end conference tables
Okay.
for law firms, for brokerage firms, and for small business owners. Somebody who wants to make a statement in their boardroom and wants a really nice table. He sells them for a lot of money.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, this isn't a great time for him.
Yeah.
Nobody needs a conference table right. Well, not nobody, but few people need a conference table right now. And, there's even some question about whether, all these clients of his that he's worked with in the past, are they even going to have offices in the future? We're all learning to
Right.
work remotely. So he's got a lot, weighing against him at the moment. And
Yeah.
he's given a lot of thought to whether he should pivot. And at least for now, he's come to the conclusion that he should not. Um, and he's trying to do that fourth approach of yours, see what happens. And he's been able to do that in part because he is getting some business. There are like government offices and places like that have every intention of always having an office that are
Yeah.
still placing orders. So he does have some business coming in. But everything else that he looked at, it was trying to do something that he's not good at. He's got, he makes one thing, he does it really well. And he thought about doing something like making a desk that you could, that he could sell cheaply for somebody who's working from home for the first time and wants a desk to put in their living room or wherever they're now setting up office. But then he'd have to compete with IKEA and Wayfair and all these places. He couldn't make it, as quickly as they do or as cheaply as they do. And he just decided to wait. How does that strike you? Have you seen other businesses where it does make sense to hold off, or do you think you really should be figuring something out at this point?
I don't believe waiting and using hope as a strategy is a dependable strategy at all. So hope is not a strategy. Um, there are some companies that obviously it's more challenging to adapt than others. I interviewed a gentleman who was in office furniture. So coincidentally, different market, right? But who's in office furniture. And he said when COVID hit, his business was instantly crushed. But instead of being crushed, you mentioned earlier in the podcast about entrepreneurs, very resilient people, right? And so right away he was like, oh, how do I have to pivot and change my message to meet the market or change the market to meet the message? And he said, I have to change the market because I mean, people are giving up their leases. Their office furniture is not a place to be in right now when everybody's working from home. And so he pivoted to the work from home crowd. And his business has taken off and thrived massively because he pivoted very, very, very quick. And he used the same market that he was reaching that was working in the office, and he tried to pivot to all those employees that are now working from home. So how do I support all those people working from home? And he's doing really well. When you're selling conference tables, obviously not everybody has got the room for a conference table inside of their home, right? But how can you support the work from home person is one, or the other question is, who currently is still buying office furniture? Because there are still people that are still working in the office. And maybe it becomes a matter of we need to niche more specifically to service that particular need. So what a lot of people don't understand is that niching is also a growth strategy. When we're trying to appeal to so many people, we have a difficult time being heard. Like, for example, if you and I were standing in the middle of a baseball game, when baseball games had crowds, right? If you and I were standing in the middle of a baseball game and we hear everybody talking and screaming and whatnot, we can't differentiate one voice from another. But I could guarantee if I was 5 rows back and I yelled, Lauren, no matter how loud and noisy it is, you're going to stop and look back because your name is what catches people's attention. Similarly, when we're in a space that's very noisy and very crowded and things are going crazy, the more niched you can become, all of a sudden you get heard. And so this is where niching become a growth strategy. And we took one agency that he was working with people from Red Bull to Coca-Cola to a whole bunch of other people when we started working together. Was doing about $1 million a year. And we said, well, the challenge is we now need to niche you because it's so difficult for you to be heard, because right now everybody and their mothers have an agency on every corner of every street. There's so many companies there. So we need to niche you so you can be heard. That became the foundation of a strategy that took him from $1 million to 3 years later, he did over 24.6 million.
Interesting.
So niching becomes a growth strategy, and that also works in a pandemic.
You've kind of just touched on this a little bit, but we got a question in submitted by one of our attendees. And by the way, any of you listening to this, if you have a question for Charlie, by all means, please drop it into chat or the Q&A. The question we have, Charlie, is what would you recommend for a company that was built for a down market? What should that company do to get a new B2B client when B2B clients are in more of a wait and see mentality right now, not in full buying mode? I think you just gave one answer to that question, going niche. Is there anything else you would suggest?
So B2B is doing fantastically well right now. Fantastically well.
Across the board.
Across the board. Across the board, it is doing awesome. And the reason for that is because the selling environment has changed. It's largely digital first. Prior to 2020, most sales were done by word of mouth, referrals, trade shows, that type of deal. When 2020 happened, most salespeople didn't really know what to do. And so they turned around and they would buy contact information on Zoom Info. They would blast it out to thousands of people, hoping to get a response. That didn't work. They'd do LinkedIn automation, hope to get a whole bunch of responses, and that didn't work. So we had to be a little bit more strategic and do things differently. Earlier in today's conversation, we talked about people need to know, like, and trust you. The problem with the way that most B2B prospecting is being done is that people don't know, like, or trust you, and yet you're trying to hit them over the head with a whole bunch of emails and LinkedIn messages. So we have to solve that problem. And we found that if we solve that problem by what we call preheating the audience before you reach out to them, the response rates go way up. And when I mean preheating the audience, let's say we've created a list of the people that we actively want to reach out to. So we take that list, and the first step that we do is we'll upload that list in places like AdRoll, which I love, AdRoll or LinkedIn, Facebook, and we'll retarget them. We're not retargeting with a conversion goal. We're retargeting for an impression goal. We just want them to see our brand over and over and over and over again. We want them to be able to say, Lauren, oh my God, I see you guys everywhere. Because at that point, we're starting to expand our share of voice. The laws of effective frequency say that somebody needs to see your brand message 20 times before becoming a buyer. So the more people see us, the more we're starting to take them from a cold to a warm prospect, plus familiarity breeds trust. So then we're warming people up. They're seeing our messages, but that just gets people to know us and kind of sort of trust us because familiarity breeds trust. But we have to then solve the like and trust portion. And that's where we can leverage LinkedIn Sales Navigator, create some engagement even before we actively reach out to people. When we actively reach out to people, then we're omni-channel. Omni-channel is not an addition problem, it's a multiplication problem. You don't just do LinkedIn plus email. You get results LinkedIn times email. And so we use LinkedIn, we use email, we use telephone. People think we're nuts using telephone, but we split tested it. 400% more appointments by using telephone. We even use good old-fashioned direct mail. We have a paper email strategy where we send paper email.
Tell me about telephone. That's interesting. This is B2B still you're talking about?
B2B, yes.
And people still pick up phone calls from unfamiliar phone numbers? I haven't done that in 10 years.
Here's the fun thing about it, right? Telephone by itself, does it work? Nope. But remember, this is a multiplication problem. Telephone times email times LinkedIn works. So we had two groups of people. We had one group that we said, you know what? Don't make any phone calls. and let's see how well this works. The other group, we said, let's add phone calls into the sequence and see how well that works. There was no differentiation, just the difference between phone calls and no phone calls. The people who used the phone calls, they didn't get through to a single gatekeeper, didn't get through to a gatekeeper, didn't talk to a decision maker, never got a return phone call back. So you would think, well, then it must not have worked. No, because they set 400% more appointments than the people who didn't make a phone call. Why? I don't know. I believe that there are reasons and results. The only thing that matters the results. My theory, though, is that you're sitting there going, my gosh, Charlie, I am seeing your ads all over the place. I'm seeing you on my newsfeed on LinkedIn. I'm seeing you commenting and liking on my posts. I'm seeing you in my inbox. Now I'm seeing you in my voicemail box. Holy cow. Persistence pays off.
Interesting.
So my COO of my company, she came from the Chet Holmes organization. She was a former president of a division of his organization. And so Chet Holmes, he's since passed, but he was known as one of the world's greatest salespeople, right? So I was listening to an interview that Chet Holmes gave way back in the day, and somebody asked Chet, what was or what is your number one sales strategy? And funny enough, Chet's number one sales strategy, he said, was persistence. It wasn't some sort of like some fancy move or whatever. It came down to persistence. And he called it pig-headed persistence was his number one sales strategy. But that becomes the challenge in B2B. Most salespeople give up too early. But when you have this omni-channel approach and you're preheating and whatnot, and by the way, I mean, I could go on and on and on about this because of how effective this is, but when it comes to preheating, if you get a cold prospect on the phone, your conversion rate is going to be about 10%, industry average, about 10%, right, for B2B. They're cold and they're a little skeptical. They're not sure if they're going to do business with you. But when you preheat them and now you get them on the phone and now they're a warm prospect, that goes from 10% to as little as 30%, often 40% conversion rate.
How do you define a warm prospect? What does it take to preheat someone?
It's really somebody who knows, likes you, and trusts you. So that preheating phase is the retargeting phase. It's also engaging with people on LinkedIn and whatnot for B2B, right? Because that works. B2C, by the way, and I'm hitting you guys with a fire hose because I want to give you as much as I can in limited time that we have together, right? Because this is what excites me. With B2C, though, we use a similar strategy, but we're targeting partners instead. So we're saying, look,
what do you mean by that? What's a partner?
So a partner is somebody who's they create a hub, right? So they're doing business with your ideal clients. So for example, when I owned a real estate development company, I had one of the highest profit margins in the entire industry. But part of why I had the highest profit margin is because I formed these partnerships with people who are also doing business with my ideal clients. And I would say, oh, you're in furniture? Can I get a preferred discount from my clients? And for anything that they buy, I want a small piece of their sale. And so I created a preferred relationship with them, preferred relationship with alarm companies, TV companies, home theater companies, alarm companies, if I didn't already say that, driveway seal coating companies. I went on and on. Anything that my clients would need, I formed a preferred relationship, and they gave me a small percentage of every sale that they did. And so that created a massive profit center for me. If I'm looking for leads and sales, I'm like, okay, where can I create a preferred relationship with somebody else? Where I can say, look, I'm in this business. If I can create a preferred advantage for your clients, would you be willing to send your clients our way? And I'll create a profit center for you. And so there's all this opportunity that's available for both B2C and B2C. When you look at my own company, right? So our company, January of 2020 compared to January of 2019, we grew 711%. And one of the major differences between my company and our growth strategy was not worrying so much about one-to-one sales. It was, how do I make one sale and benefit from multiple sales? So for example, we formed a relationship with one particular partner. That one particular partner provides 20 deals or opportunities to us every single week, minimum 20 opportunities a week. So I make one sale and then ultimately end up having these 20 opportunities per week. So it's like, how do I make even more of those sales to create that much more leverage? Does that make sense?
It does. That's 700% growth. That was January 19 to January 20.
January 19th through January 2020. So our January 2019 compared to January 2020, we had 711% bigger month in January. I'm sorry, January 2020 compared to January 2021. Our January 2021 was 711% greater than January
Oh, got it.
2020.
Okay, so it's just this month,
Yeah, I
this
mean,
year,
our company grew
or this past
by
month.
by many hundreds of percent in 2020. I just don't remember that number offhand.
Well, that leads me to a question. And by the way, again, we do have limited time. So if you have a question for Charlie, please ask it now. But Charlie, I know you like to say that you love a bad economy. And that kind of plays into what you were just saying about your growth January over January. Why do you love a bad economy?
Yeah, it's funny. I get a lot of people asking me that question, and I wrote about it in my book, right? It's, I think, the first chapter where I say, I love a bad economy. Um, People believe that they're far more strategic than they are when the markets are doing well, because you don't have to work that hard to make a sale. It's when the markets change that the strategic people are going to survive, and those who are less strategic, it's almost like a natural purging process. If you noticed when the market shut down in 2020, almost right away, people started scaling back. They scaled back their marketing, scaled back their advertising. They started laying off and, you know, we're, what do you call it? Protecting themselves, right? And so for guys like me, that just opened up the playing field because people are still buying. It's just we have to change the message in order to capitalize on the opportunities. But now people are still buying, but it's like going to Disney World and nobody's in line for the rides, right? I can still now I just have to become a little bit more strategic in order to capture more market share. And so that's why I love a bad economy, because most people will wait and hope for things to change. Most people will scale back. It's the people and the people that I would be afraid of are the people that are going to lean in and say, where's the opportunity right now? Because there is always opportunity. Look, you know, we can go to the smallest molecule observable by man, and you're going to see that there's always a positive and a negative energy. And you can always see that, you know, whether we're environments or economic patterns or whatever it is, with every up, there's a down. With it, the Chinese figured this out, the yin yang. With every negative, there's an equal and opposite opportunity. And the same thing happens in a bad economy. With every challenge, there's a million opportunities. You just got to look for it. It's just a little bit different.
We got a very smart question in chat from actually a friend of mine, Ramon Ray, a very smart observer of the small business scene. He's asking for the growth you had January to January. What did you have to do to scale internally? Did you have to hire a lot of people? How did you handle that 700% growth?
We have had to hire. The way that we scale, so we map out our years at a time. We, even though we're a small business, we like to think of ourselves almost like a public company. And so a public company will say, okay, I'm going to put together our forecast for the quarter and even for the year. And if they're one penny off from their forecast, what happens to the company? What happens to the shares, Lauren, if they're one penny off? They're in trouble, right? So we take this very seriously. We put a lot of thought into what our pro
Not that that
forma.
makes any sense, by the way.
I know.
but I take your point.
So, but we set our pro formas very intentionally. We're very diligent as to saying, okay, here's what our pro forma is going to look like, and we map it out for the year. So I can tell you right off the bat, and every day we go back to the pro forma and we update it based on the revenues that have been received and the new clients that we have and whatnot. We update it so that we know how close are we to being on track with the pro forma, or how, are we exceeding or are we not exceeding? Because we already know, in accordance to our pro forma, we have earmarked this is when we need to bring in more resources, more resources, more resources. And if we're ahead of our pro forma, that just moved up the timeline for when we need to bring in more resources. But earlier in our conversation, we talked about the 3 ways to grow the business: optimization, systemization, and innovation. The reason why we do it this way is, from the optimization part, we want to make sure that we're creating a finely tuned machine. Once we created that finely tuned machine, entrepreneurs have got a million balls running or juggling at any given point in time. But Lauren, if you've ever seen a juggler juggling 10 balls all at once and they drop one, what happens?
They get fired.
Well, they might. But usually if they drop one after juggling 10, all of them fall down. And so with an entrepreneur, that's where I go to optimization, systemization. So you systemize as many processes as possible in the company so the company is not dependent on you or any one of those key employees. So it makes scaling that much easier when you have systems for all of your key processes across the board. So when you bring somebody else in, they're following the system. So another thing that we talked about was the challenges that entrepreneurs have. There are 2 major points that entrepreneurs are going to face an extraordinary amount of challenge. And I had a mentor of mine very early on that said, you're going to be the closest you have ever been to success at the very moment you want to give up more than anything else in the world. I now know what he's talking about. And so that first part is when you're starting off, when you don't have a lot of momentum and you're like, you start with a lot of optimism and excitement. You're like, this is going to be awesome. And then all of a sudden it just takes a lot longer than you thought. Maybe a few bumps in the road and you keep wondering, should I give up? Should I quit? I'm not sure. This is so painful. Eventually something happens and you keep through it and you get this spike of momentum. You get this nice little parabolic lift. And then of course you're going to have your bumps and your bruises as you try to figure this out, whatnot, but you get through it. And then you get to this other point. And this other point is what a lot of companies don't prepare for. It's when you're actually most successful, when the company is scaling and growing really, really well. And we encountered this ourselves. And it was a very surprisingly and shockingly scary point where you just don't know if you're going to be able to survive it. And if you look at your business like a rocket ship, you're growing like this super, super fast, right? But then all of a sudden, as you start growing, as you're growing, you're at a point where you can be intimately involved with every employee and client relationship that you have. But then it gets to a point where you've grown to such a point where you can't be intimately involved with every employee anymore. You can't be intimately involved with every client. And the booster starts to separate from the rocket. And so as the business owner, you have a vision and you're constantly sharing all these promises. If the booster isn't aligned with the rocket ship and that gap starts to widen, that can actually tank the company. And so we're trying to figure out, and through systems, we managed to align both the booster and the rocket ship to make sure that everything is alignment. And so we're in lockstep with one another.
Is that where are you at this point? Are you experiencing some of that?
It's a good question. We're still at this point. The booster started to separate and then we brought it close together. We're not in what I would say, we're not clear, in safety and focus on other things. My focus in Q1 of this year was less on growth, or is less on growth. It's more on optimization and systemization. So we've grown so fast that it's starting to expose different challenges that I, for a million years, didn't even know was a challenge.
And you know what you're describing? You're describing something that an author named Doug Tatum wrote about in one of my favorite books about entrepreneurship. It's called No Man's Land. And
excellent book.
His experience has been, and he's observed this in lots and lots of companies, including his own, is that every successful business goes through this at some point where the things that have worked for you to get you to this point no longer work for you. And you have to make some changes, just what you're describing. And some of those changes may be getting rid of employees who were very loyal and worked very hard, but are not equipped to handle the job that needs to be done going forward. And that can be incredibly painful. It sounds like your experience, not necessarily the employee situation, but that the general sense of having to make changes and do things a little bit differently. It sounds like maybe that's what you're thinking about a little bit.
Yeah, actually, that's such a good book. That book, by the way, Doug's book, is required reading for our clients who reach a certain level of success. It's a tremendous, tremendous book. And for any of the listeners here, it's called No Man's Land. I would recommend it. Doug Tatum is his last name,
Yes.
right? You asked me a question, and I just completely went
No,
ADD.
I asked you if you were being affected by that same kind of thing, and I think
Yeah.
you answered that you are experiencing some of it.
Yeah, and to be transparent, right? We're not out of no man's land yet. Where the beautiful thing is, we're growing. The challenge every challenge has an equal and opposite opportunity. The same thing rings true, by the way. Every opportunity comes with it an equal opposite challenge.
It's like the company that suddenly gets that big contract to deliver whatever they make to Walmart. And can they gear up to produce in
Yes.
the scale that they need to, making the changes that Walmart demands and handling all of that? They're not going to do it with the team that got them to that point. They've got to make big changes.
And I'll tell you, yesterday particularly was a very, very stressful time for me because everything, all of the challenges all seem to happen like one after the other, after the other, after the other, in rapid fire. And I'm like, it's only so much for me to, to go around. And my team at this point, they're very stretched. Certain key members of the team, they're very stressed. But it all comes down to perspective. And I had to get myself back in this place of just feeling grateful, because when we look around at the businesses that are having challenges, the challenges that I'm being faced with right now, Tony Robbins and I traveled the world with Tony. I invested a lot more money than I probably care to admit to pay Tony to travel with him.
Interesting.
But Tony said to me, he's like, big people have big problems. Small people have small problems. If you want to tell the size of a problem, if you want to see the size of a person, look for the size of their problems. And when I look at the problems that we're having right now, even though they are bigger problems, they're so much better than some of the other problems I could be facing. So I try to remind myself of that and just be super, super grateful. And look, at today's day and age, if you're making enough money to put food on your table, maybe put a little something, in the bank, if you're growing, if you're healthy, if you're whatever, but you're faced with hiring problems, or you're faced with, those are good problems. Those are good problems.
That's a great point to stop on. I could talk to you all day, Charlie, but we got to close this. What if one of our listeners wants to get in touch with you and learn more? What should they do?
Well, I definitely highly encourage them to go over to Predictable Profits. And in fact,
predictableprofits.com.
predictableprofits.com. Please let me know that you're a listener here to the podcast. Would just love to be able to connect the dots on how we've gotten to know one another. And one of the beautiful things, as you talked about, for the right business owner that's really looking to grow, we're in the results-based business. And so because of that, we don't believe in really hard selling anybody. We want to be able to deliver results in advance and be able to find possibilities and ways in which we can grow and add value to the business. And if that's there, that's why we start every relationship with a coaching session. And that opportunity is available to you if you go over to predictableprofits.com and Happy to support you.
So this video, you could say, is kind of a exercise in preheating, wouldn't you say?
Ah, very good. Good job, Danielson.
Charlie Gaudet, Predictable Profits. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. And thank you, everybody, for listening.